What's going on, everybody? Mortem here, this time bringing you 5 builds for beginners in Pathfinder Wrath of the Righteous. Now, surprisingly, as much as I have covered this game, I have not actually made a video like this. I've talked about classes for beginners or favorite builds in general, but I've never actually made a list of builds specifically for beginners. So right there, though, what that means is that these builds are typically easier to play, quite frankly, a little less mechanically complex than some of the higher end gameplay would really require. And while all of these builds are very doable on, say, core difficulty or below, which includes normal, which I assume is where most beginners would start, if not even lower, they are therefore very suited to normal mode and regular gameplay. If anything, you could actually take these a little farther than where most beginners would start. Now, in this video, I'm going to give you kind of a rundown of these builds and talk about them and what they aim to achieve, really, and then I will post the links to the actual builds below where you can check them out in full. And because this video is aimed at beginners, one last thing I want to mention before we jump into it is that when it comes to mythic paths on difficulties like normal, which one you choose isn't as big of a deal as higher difficulties. Obviously, you want to pick something that complements your build, but it's not going to destroy your character to pick something a little strange. The one thing you do kind of generally want to follow, though, is the alignment specific stuff. Like if you want to go Angel, you're going to want to be a good character. There's a little bit of leeway even there, but typically you want to stick to those alignment restrictions, or guidelines, I should say. And while most of these builds have a mythic path recommendation and obviously have a lot of choices, I would encourage beginners to deviate from those where they want to and kind of learn the systems for yourself, more or less. Because these are a great place to start. If you're not using them with the intent to learn, you're not really going to be setting yourself up for success later if you try to go to higher difficulties, for instance. But with no further ado, let's actually jump into this. My number one pick that we're going to start the video out with is the Stoneheart build that I made. Now, this is a bit of a themed build, but it is specifically made around the Slayer class and the Deliverer archetype, more specifically. This build is great for beginners because Slayers in general are probably the single easiest class to play in this game. Almost all of their buffs and things are passive. You really don't have to click a lot of buttons. And the Deliverer archetype takes that even a little bit farther, getting an ability called Divine Anathema, which just straight up adds baseline damage if you are a few steps away on the alignment chart from the thing you are attacking, which in this case would be Chaotic Evil. So you'd want to get 2 steps away from Chaotic Evil, which still leaves a ton of possibilities open for you, and then you're pretty much golden. But beyond that, the Stoneheart is a build I made primarily for roleplay value. It's again good on core difficulty just because the Slayers get so much kind of free, easy damage. But the roleplay side of this that you could easily change by selecting a different race, etc. if you want to. But the roleplay part of this was an Oread, which is a sort of elemental earth being, and then making them this sort of stone-hearted killer, which is what a Deliverer really is. But more than anything, a super easy class to play. They get a ton of passive bonuses. And at the same time, they also have great damage because of that, and it's just a great place to start for beginners. Now, for Mythic Path here, personally, I would probably go Aeon, just because it's a little more defensive in nature and lets you take buffs off of your enemies, etc. But Angel is also a very popular choice and would fit right in with this build. Although you might also consider going Trickster, because if you're talking pure damage, which isn't really necessary for beginners, Trickster is probably the best way to go, but I would say Angel or Aeon personally. Moving on to our second build, we have my Demon Slayer, which is actually also the name of the archetype for the Ranger that this build uses. This is another very simple one. Demon Slayer Rangers are just about regular Rangers, except rather than make choices about their favorite enemy, that is to say an enemy that they get passive buffs to attacking, they instead only get those buffs for demons, which is a choice you could have normally made, but here we don't make a choice, it's just demons and they kind of choose it for you. This is a really fantastic archetype for this game where like 80 to 90% of what you're fighting is demons. Combine that with the fact that Ranger is already a pretty strong class from a damage perspective. Not the best, but good. And you've got an incredibly easy and thematic class to play. Again, Ranger, much like Slayer, actually gets a lot of their buffs just passively, and they don't really have to do much besides stand and hit, and then at level 4 they can even pick up an animal companion, which is always fun. And while it is slightly more complex overall, it's still a very simple and easy way to play the game. And in terms of what mythic path to choose, this one is again very, very versatile. And what I would recommend are the usual suspects here. Angel, Trickster, you might try a Zada with this one. That'll actually give you a second companion via Ivu, which can be a lot of fun generally. The late game mythic paths, which are unlockable, are kind of the only ones I wouldn't really recommend for this. And that's not to say you couldn't work with some of them, but generally they don't have a lot of things that would bleed into this very well. But other than that, you've got some options and it's a super easy class to play. That again gets a ton of damage. For our third and fourth entries, we're going to be talking about some things that are a little more mechanically complex. These are a little bit harder in terms of actually playing them, but I'm including them on this list because they are still relatively simple while also kind of pushing you into something a little more mechanically heavy. For our third entry, we have the Devil's Advocate, as I like to call it. This is a build that I made specifically for the Devil mythic path, which I mention because with the Enhanced Edition coming up, and part of the reason this video is being released is because the Enhanced Edition is releasing, and that particular version of the game is supposed to kind of potentially, we've heard, buff the mythic path. So it might be something to look into if you're wanting to do a Devil playthrough. But the Devil mythic path is very late in the game, and for most of it, you'd probably be running Aeon. But all of that aside, let's actually talk about the actual War Priest. The War Priest itself is a hybrid class of Cleric and Fighter. Now, this does a few cool things for us. For starters, we get the Cleric's domains, so they will have a domain that they can then get spells from, which gives them a little bit of casting ability. They also get some buffs to their character, such as Sacred Armor and Sacred Weapon. These are really cool buffs that you do have to activate, but they can still be very strong. And what we're going to be doing with our War Priest in particular is making them a cult leader. So this archetype is actually what inspired the build, but essentially what this archetype actually does is trades off some proficiencies and gives you things like sneak attack instead, so you're capable of doing a bit more damage. But more than anything, it's role-playing friendly for kind of leaning into the Devil mythic path, which is lawful evil, so you could role-play this as like a cult leader for like Asmodeus, for instance, which gives a lot of thematic reasoning behind the, again, Devil mythic path. More than anything, the War Priest represents an opportunity to learn some of the more interesting mechanics while also still being quite strong. But basically all you've really got to do is turn on some buffs and you'll effectively get to attack. So you've got some mechanics you can actually play around with. You've got sneak attack damage, you've got solid damage overall, the ability to cast spells, which is going to give you a bit more utility in general in terms of what you can give to the party, be that various buffs about, protecting or mitigating damage, etc. Now, in terms of mythic path for this one, I personally think Aeon's the way to go, especially if you want to do the Devil mythic path, because Aeon is more of a lawful one, and then Devil is, of course, lawful evil. So Aeon kind of bleeds into that really well naturally. However, if you don't want to go the evil route, what I would suggest instead is Angel. Angel actually gets a similar weapon buff to War Priest that should stack and can be very strong together. But if you do want to go the evil route, definitely go Aeon and then into Devil later when it becomes a possibility. But that brings us to number 4 on the list. And this is arguably the most complex build on this list, and I call it the Tactician. This particular build utilizes the Inquisitor class, or more specifically, the Tactical Leader archetype. Now, this build is a little less about actually dealing damage and more about supporting your party. But again, this is probably the most mechanically complex class on this list, and it's one that I would push you to try just because it's got more going on and you'll learn some of the systems a bit more. But the gist of the Tactical Leader archetype is that you can pass on teamwork feats to the rest of your team as an action. And teamwork feats are feats you can give to 2 characters, and if they both have it, then they'll get a bonus. Well, Tactical Leader allows you to give your entire party these, while actually being the only person with it. And moreover, they get bonus teamwork feats, so they don't have to spend any extra feats on these feats themselves. They will get bonus feats specifically for this ability, which is a pretty cool one overall. But on top of this, we also get access to all of the fun things that an Inquisitor normally gets, such as Inquisitor's Bane, which is a very strong damage buff that is active, so you have to activate it for it to work, but it's called Inquisitor's Bane. It just gives a flat damage boost to your attacks in combat. You also get spellcasting, much like the War Priest, and you also get access to Judgments. These are Inquisitor specific, and they're essentially buffs you can activate that grow in power as you level up. So what starts off as relatively small buffs can increase and give you all sorts of protections. These are buffs you would kind of turn off and on as needed, so again, a little more active involvement in using them. And last but not least, the Inquisitors also get to pick a domain as well, and they can actually pick things like an animal domain to then give them an animal companion. And more than anything, there are just so many ways to play an Inquisitor and all sorts of weapons and build combos you could go with that I think it's a great class to push people into learning more about the system. But again, it is a little more complicated than the others that we've mentioned up to this point. But if you follow my build, I think it's a lot of fun. You'll learn a lot about the game by playing this one in particular. And that brings us to number 5 on our list, and it is another very, very easy one to play. And that is none other than the Knife Master Rogue. So this one is actually more of a holdover for Kingmaker, but it's still pretty effective here. Now, I wouldn't recommend this one for higher difficulties, just because it's good, but there's better ways to go, frankly. Nonetheless, though, very strong build. It gets a ton of sneak attack damage, and that is because Knife Masters replace the normal 1d6 that is attributed to sneak attack damage or sneak attack dice, and they turn that into 1d8 for knives in particular, so things like sais, kukris, daggers, etc. So they do a ton of sneak attack damage, more than normal if they are using knives, hence why they are called Knife Masters. But that's basically it. Beyond that, they can kind of spec into whatever skill you need them to do, but they basically just run around and stab things from there, and sneak attack is very easy to get in Wrath of the Righteous. Basically, you just need to be flanking something to get sneak attacks, and pretty much everything else they get is just passive, actually. And then if you take all 20 levels in Knife Master, they do get a really cool ability that, while pretty much unusable on higher difficulties, gives you a chance to just one-shot enemies, which can be pretty fun if you're playing on like normal, where it might actually take effect. But more than anything, the Knife Master Rogue is just a very easy class to play, much like the Slayer. You don't need to know a lot about the game to make the most out of it. Basically, just equip the character with daggers and you're good to go. Take the appropriate feats and you're pretty much golden. They will deal a ton of damage. And if you've taken all 20 levels, they even have the potential to one-shot things. But there you guys go, 5 builds for beginners that are quite easy to play, and I think are a great place to start learning the game and jumping into it for the first time. I would tell you here at the end of this video, if you want to play something just because you want to play it, that is as good a reason as any. Even if you want to play something that's very mechanically complex, go for it. Maybe adjust the difficulty and learn on the fly. As long as you're enjoying the game, that's really what counts the most. And this video is really just helpful suggestions to get you started. And while character creation can be pretty overwhelming, if something looks interesting to you, I would say latch onto it and learn everything about it. But that's all I've got for you guys today. I hope you enjoyed the video. If you did, like, comment, subscribe, all that YouTube jazz. But regardless of any of that, truly, thank you so much for watching. I really do appreciate it. May you wander in wisdom and have an amazing day.